UAPs, unidentified anomalous phenomena, are secret military black projects, false flag alien invasion psyop, drones or other human-made aircraft. Join UFO historian Don Ecker, MUFON State Director for New York Chris DiPerno, retired veteran pilot Commander Cobra, and well-esteemed host and researcher Martin Willis as they discuss the latest news and topics regarding UAPs with a no-holds-barred approach on UAP Crossfire.
This is UAP Crossfire. I'm Martin Willis, and I'm hosting today. And over, let's see, am I doing it? Yeah, I got to turn this way.
That's right.
Over here, we got detective and longtime UFO researcher Chris DiPerno. Let's see, everybody. I got to go down here. We have a longtime researcher Don Ecker, and over this way we have Christian Lambright. He is filling in for Commander Cobra today. I've known Chris for many years, and he's a longtime UFO researcher, and he's going to be talking in the second half of the show about the Paul Bennewitz case, which is a fascinating case, if you ask me. Very convoluted, a lot of disinformation. The poor guy was tortured and all that. So the first part of the show, we're going to be talking about the Sean Kirkpatrick's, his op-ed, and a couple of other comments that he has said over the last week or so. Before we get started, I just want to run a clip here. I had the pleasure of interviewing Representative Tim Burchett today for next week's show, and I'm just going to put a teaser clip up. And also, I'll give you a sample of some of the technology issues that Tim had, and he's a riot. And here we go.
And they said, "Hey, man, you've really," and I'll paraphrase, I can't remember exactly, but he said, he went on something like, "You've really kicked the hornet's nest at the Pentagon." And he said, "But you need to get some bodies around you." Wow. And I said, "Yeah, I come in Tennessee. I don't know. We take things a little different down here, dude." But and I realized I've kicked the hornet's nest, and the big boys are coming after me, and they're coming after me in this election, and they'll do everything they can to discredit me, because really, all Washington is a portfolio over people. It's just about, they don't care. As long as these missile defense companies are putting out this high-tech stuff in their stock portfolio, it's not natural for somebody to make 30 or 40% year in and year out. And all right, hold on.
Yep, no hurry. Yep.
Okay, I don't even remember what I was saying. I was getting irate about something.
That'll be next Tuesday here on this YouTube channel, and also podcast UFO and KGRA radio, the full interview. But anyway, gentlemen, he's a character, isn't he? And isn't it great? There's such bipartisan work that has been done, trying to get to the bottom of this whole thing. I mean, I think it's great.
He's feisty. I mean, he's not afraid to take people on and call them out. He's done that with the government. He's done that with the intelligence agencies. He's one had a press conference that says the reason things aren't going forward is because the intelligence communities are putting a lot of pressure on people for this. So,
gentlemen, I've said it 1,000 times, and I'm going to say it one more. Doesn't seem to connect with anybody, and it doesn't seem most people are not even probably aware of what the hell I'm saying. But here it is. This whole disclosure thing, in my opinion, is nothing but a pipe dream. A pipe dream. Sure, there's been a little leak here, a little leak there, but the bottom line is, and I said this distinctly in the paper I just wrote, there is a core secret concerning this UFO phenomenon, and this core secret is surrounded by a special access program, an SAP. which means that if you're not in the book, you're never going to know what's going on. This is never going to be released. Whatever that secret is, I believe the powers that be are terrified that if it becomes public knowledge, they will lose control. And they'll never do that, ever.
Well, Don, they got people running in so many different directions. They want to say it's secret military.
By design, Chris, by design.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. But look how they changed the narrative. They changed the narrative. You can hear people in the Pentagon talking, it's demonic. It's demonic. They're all demons. And then you got another UFO group over here. It's our secret space force, and we got to protect our secret space force. Then it's aliens, and then they're living under the water. I mean, they got everybody.
Don't forget interdimensional.
And
that's the new one. Yeah,
that's the new one, interdimensional. You know, they have people like Tucker Carlson going on the air, and there's a short clip of him. He's saying, "This is so bad. This is so dark. I couldn't tell my wife about it. The secrets that I found out from people who were telling me that it's so traumatic that I couldn't sleep at night." And then people, you know, they go, "Oh my God, you know, maybe this is the end of the world. Maybe the rapture is coming." You know.
Speaking about fear pimping, okay? Today,
that's a good word for it.
Yeah, today I saw something. I was up on Facebook. I don't know why I still go up there, but I do. And on Facebook, there was this video clip talking about NASA allegedly sighting an incoming asteroid, okay, that according to this so-called report, there's a 73% chance it's going to impact the Earth, and it's going to happen in September. Now, this was
Germany.
The first time I ever heard this, okay? The first time. Oh, you guys are familiar with it?
I heard it was going to something about Germany. It was possible that it looks like it would be hitting around Germany.
Well, that would be the end of Europe, and for the most part, the end of humanity, if it were true. Yeah. But I haven't heard it before, and I would think that if something like that had that high of a probability, that it would be around the net by now. And
I don't know where that came from. And today we can't trust anything today. We have to follow it right to the original source if possible. But really, it's really hard to believe anything. Chris, I don't know if you had any opinions on Burchett or any of that other stuff, but
Burchett, how can you not like the guy? He's about as most direct, straight talk as you can get. As far as, I mean, if you wanted to get talking about what I think is going on ever since, actually, I would say since probably 2009, when Harry Reid, or late 2008, because I think the whole thing was co-opted. And well, let me give you my quick synopsis of this. Lou Elizondo supposedly, and I'm pretty sure it came through him, released his IG report. Now, I know I got a copy of it through Alejandro Rojas, but that was a couple of months after Lou even sent it. You can't go to the IG department to get it. But in that IG report, he was stating that Stratton had come to see him 2 months before the Bass contract even came out, like June of 2008. And after a couple of weeks, then Stratton introduced him to Lou Elizondo for security reasons. But I'm like, wait a minute, how come Lukotsky and none of these guys have ever said, well, wait, but by the time the contract came out, the cat was out of the bag? That apparently someone at the DOD knew it was coming and had gone in and interjected Elizondo into it. But then by 2006, if you've read the first 10-month report, and I've read some of the reviews, you can go online and find the documentation, that they were doing supposedly a glorious job. They'd done all of these reports. They were going to get the next installment of the money. But Harry Reid's already trying to turn it into an SAP. And I'm like, why would you do that if you were doing a good job? If you were filling the bill as far as your DI contract, and you were standing to get the next money, and it was being run in-house by Bass, Column, Hal, those guys, and they were doing well. Why would Harry Reid suddenly want to turn it all over to the DoD as a special access program? But of course that didn't happen, but then the money ends up drying up. I've often wondered, well, might there have been some kind of thumb screws put on these guys? Because if it turned out you had a contract that was made to look like pure science for advanced aerospace weapon systems applications, but it was really just a UFO effort, could someone have gone to them and said, isn't that kind of deceptive if you went and got taxpayer money under a guise that's not really what you were doing? Would that have put the DIA in the hot seat? But needless to say, if you go especially forward to the point of To the Stars, you've got Kit Green going and meeting Tom DeLonge at that restaurant near the Pentagon. And if you've listened to some of the interviews Jim Simivan has done, he's actually come back and said, first, of course, if you checked him out, he had supposedly retired from the CIA 15 years before. But in his own interviews, he comes back and says he took a little time off and then he went back to work for them, doing consultant work or whatever else. But he recently, in some of the interviews he's put out, has stated that he was then told to go meet Tom DeLonge in San Diego, or he says he went to San Diego to meet Tom DeLonge because there was concerns. He says we were concerned that there were some leaks that might have gotten into his book, into Tom DeLonge's book. And so he says in an interview, I'm not sure if it was Theory of Everything, one of those interviews, he said, so I flew out and a couple of other people to San Diego to meet with Tom DeLonge. But I quickly realized Tom's a smart guy. But then he says the next day they met for lunch and Hal Puthoff shows up. And Jim Simivan helped Tom DeLonge sketch out the idea for To the Stars on a napkin. My first thought is, wait a minute. Who directed Jim Simivan to go talk to Tom DeLonge?
Christian, let me ask you a question.
Sure.
And this is a question.
And let me make a point here. A lot of things I've researched, a lot of things people these days call researchers are reciters. They're just talking about what they were. So everything I'm telling you, I've either got it from a YouTube video or whatever else. It's not that I picked up the phone and talked to some of these people myself.
Okay, that's fair.
Go ahead.
That's very fair. How in the hell did a rock and roll performer get tied up with these government or supposedly government heavyweights? Hal Puthoff, Kit Green, Skinner from Lockheed, Christopher Mellon, for God's sake, a former Undersecretary of Defense, a rock and roll guy.
Okay, if you go and read, and in fact, if you go to WikiLeaks and you look through all the emails that were written back and forth between who was Hillary Clinton's Podesta and Tom DeLonge.
Yeah.
Tom DeLonge is writing to John Podesta and talking about how things go along, how he was invited out to Lockheed and all this. There is also a link in one of those links on there to get a copy of Secret Machines. I found it. I was surprised because in the intro, like the foreword to Secret Machines, he explains, in my opinion, from looking at it, how he basically got hooked up with these other guys, Kit Green and Holm. My reason I mentioned that is because it seems to me after that occurred, I don't hear any more about his generals, his Air Force generals that he began with. The story, if I can make it brief, and feel free for Tom DeLonge to come on and correct me, was that he was invited. Lockheed had decided to have an open house kind of thing, but nobody was going to go inside, so it was going to be out in the parking lot. All the families could get together. For whatever reason, somebody told him, they invited Tom DeLonge. He then told them he'd be glad to show up, but he wanted to have 5 minutes to talk to the top guy at Lockheed. I'll give him credit. The guy's got a lot of, can I say the balls word? The guy's got a lot of balls to pull that. But he went there and apparently they acquiesced and they eventually gave him 5 minutes with like the top guy who I don't recall his name right off the top of my head. But that's when he broached something, if I recall, the idea that apparently a lot of government industry and internal intelligence kind of things are getting kind of a bad rap. And how can they make young people today have a better attitude? And maybe that rung some bells. And the guys that he was talking to at the time, he had met a guy from Space Command and McCaslin, a general, Air Force general named McCaslin, who I think is now working for a company out in Albuquerque. But he talked to McCaslin, and apparently there was some interest there. And I don't mean McCaslin was going to sign on, but McCaslin was talking to Tom DeLonge somewhere. And this, I believe, was near the end of 2015. A lot of these emails, I think you'll see, were coming right through the summer, right after he had met the people at Lockheed. Then all of a sudden, he sends an email and he says the head of Lockheed at the time had told him there was a person, very important person, who wanted to meet him, but he would have to fly to Washington, D.C. So he did it. He flew out there, found a restaurant. They went to the back at a table of some sort. The guy that was the head of Lockheed was there as well. So for some reason, he on his own flew out there. When I first read it, it doesn't name the person he met, but this is who Tom DeLonge refers to as his CIA man. But if you read the description, when I read it, of course, that wasn't proof, but the description of a guy with a beard and glasses and look really firm and sit there, to me at that moment, I thought, this is Kit Green. I believe since then, Tom DeLonge has even acknowledged it and others that it was Kit Green. And afterwards, according to the forward in his notes, this person said to Tom as they were leaving, things like this don't happen in the halls of power. I may be paraphrasing a little bit, but it's close. They happen when people like us get together and decide to kick the ball down the field. Now, to me, that thought, wait, doesn't that sound like a rogue operation of some sort? I don't know, except obviously these were not people, according to Kit Green. He's supposedly not actively working in the government any longer, so it wasn't a rogue operation. But a letter that Tom DeLonge wrote to, I think it was to John Podesta, not long after this, says he's then supposed to fly to Houston to meet some very important people, or excuse me, fly to Texas to meet some very important people. A friend of mine said, oh, that's got to be Hal. And that was the only person that fit. He didn't name who it was at the time. But if that's the case, then you have Kit Green meeting Tom DeLonge. How did Kit Green even know of Tom DeLonge's interest at that point? It hadn't been going on but for a few months. And I think the letters I'm talking about by now were as quickly as like October. But apparently, Kit Green is able to call the head of Lockheed and get him. Now, why he didn't just call Tom DeLonge himself, I don't know. But the CIA man, and that's what Tom DeLonge called him. So if nothing else, you put the CIA right into it at that point. Calls the head of Lockheed, gets Tom DeLonge to fly out to Washington. They meet in a private setting. Tom DeLonge explains, I guess, what he wants to do.
Well, all that mystique has a certain cachet.
Of course, it does. Sounds good in the book, too, to make you secret machines and all of that. But subsequently, I happen to think that it's definitely true. He's writing it to John Podesta. As of that moment, that's when you begin to have Tom DeLonge talking more and more with this group of people we hear of. Suddenly, at some point, and I'm still trying to track down the exact date on this, at some point you have Jim Simivan. Apparently and the impression I'm getting, because he's saying he went back to work for the CIA part-time as a consultant, whatever else. And he said for the next 12, 13 years, if you look at the timing, he was still working for the CIA at the time he's helping Tom DeLonge pencil out how they're going to do To the Stars. And I think a lot of us looked at the original To the Stars setup and looked at their advisors and realized how many of those guys are former CIA people. It was loaded with them. So I don't know what exactly that means, but the CIA, I believe, came in, and it strikes me because we don't hear any more of McCaslin or Tom's Air Force generals after he goes and meets this person at the Pentagon, his CIA.
Well, what's that tell you? It tells you that they got their fingers in all of it. Now, if we work on that assumption that they have their fingers in all of it, I was in the military. I was in military intelligence. So I have somewhat of a knowledge how this business works. Okay. And the bottom line is, as far as I'm concerned, that whole thing has been compromised from top to bottom.
Yes. That's exactly, and I'm not saying I can prove it yet, but that's exactly why I brought up Harry Reid's 2009 letter. Right in June, 2 months, right at about the time the 10-month report comes out. They're doing well. They're about to get their next installment of $5 million or however much it was. And suddenly he wants to turn a complete reversal from this unclassified program they were set up to investigate UFOs and whatnot, to hand it over to the DOD as a special access program. That would have cut off anything else. And in my opinion, you already brought Lou in there to run security on it. And not too long after this whole thing went belly up at the DIA, which I don't know whether that was something in the compromising. In other words, they managed to cut off the DIA funding. I think there's some funding that I saw in one of the contracts that came out of the NSA's funding office after that. But for some reason, it all went belly up. Do you realize we paid for more than just that first year, the $22 million? But we have not seen any sign that I have seen of another 10-month report.
And a lot of that money went to the Bigelow space people.
May have. I have a feeling that some of that money, well, I don't want to say anything and really talk out of school that might get myself in any hot water, but I think there was a lot of people dipping into that till. And if you understand, these are people that were with Bigelow all the way back. And interestingly enough, we may all know here that according, especially even something Jacques Vallée had pointed out, and I went to check on it, Vallée had been offered to be the director of NIDS years ago, but he was apparently occupied with other things and he turned it down at the time. And it was supposedly given to Kit Green. But I went back to archive.org, the Wayback Machine, looked at the old website. I can't find Kit Green's name on there anywhere. You have Hal's picture, you've got other people's faces. Kit Green seems to, and I will say, I've seen plenty of shows where Kit Green was on. He seems like an extremely likable guy, which I guess would be a benefit if you're working for the CIA. But needless to say, I have no doubt about how intelligent he is. But no different than years ago, even during the cattle mutilation period. Not many people realize, Rommel was called in to kind of oversee the investigation and pretty much bury it. But apparently, Kit Green was the one who got Rommel in it. And Jacques Vallée had made this point, and a friend of mine had talked to Jacques and said, "Who told you that?" And he said, "Kit Green told me." So, but this is the Kit Green who was also writing the emails that Eric Davis referred to about the alien autopsies that he had seen at the CIA, and he knew of 3 of them. Nowadays, I think Keith Basterfield had checked with him on it, and Kit Green seemed to walk all that back. Well, it was, but at the time, he's writing it to Eric, who's spreading it to Bob Bigelow, where the money is. And a lot of these people, and that's actually what I think we have going on at the moment. I say I think because I don't have enough proof.
Or you've seen how Davis has totally disappeared after the Thomas Wilson fiasco. Okay. He's made himself scarce. And
publicly he has. And if you may remember, one of the earliest things he did was an interview with Linda Howe. And at that moment in the interview, you can hear him when they bring up the term ATIP, because I think a lot of people these days consider ATIP and OSAP as the same thing. I don't. Eric Davis says in that interview, ATIP, oh, Harry Reid just made that up off the top of his head for that letter, that 2009 letter. I believe ATIP was just their colloquial name they gave to the group of people that I call the Sacerdotal Knights that were in the Eric Davis letter, which is Hal, Kit Green. And oddly enough, Kit Green's in on that letter, but Kit Green supposedly wasn't working for Bass. So why is he in on the emails that are being sent? At least Jacques Vallée had some involvement working on the database. But needless to say, I think ATIP was just what they considered themselves. And when Harry Reid wanted to make it look like it was some official group, he came up with the name ATIP. And after that, they just tried to refer to them as the same thing. One's a nickname for the other. But OSAP was just the name on the contract, the DI contract. That was all.
Well, this Christian is in the same city, but it's a different avenue. All right. A little metaphor there. Are you familiar and have you done any research or dug into the so-called Collins elite in the Pentagon?
No, I have not done enough. All I know, Nick Redfern, was he the one that wrote a book?
Yes.
Yes. And I think not long ago actually was the first time I've ever heard of the Collins elite. Now, a lot of names go about. Back in your and my day, MJ-12 started up. It was the big thing. I don't believe MJ-12 was really ever a name for anything, or they wouldn't have put it in a document they were going to slip over to Bennewitz. Why would you put the real name for it anyway? And after that, we got all the variations, Majority 12, Majestic 12, whatever else. The one thing that I consider something I think is curious, I'd like to look into, because when it comes to classified programs, this is a group that not many people are familiar with. the term the Senior Review Group. Before boy, I'd look at it if I can remember the whole details of it now. If you want to start a classified program, you have to submit it to your central committee or whatever it's called in your department. They can then, if they choose that it's worthwhile, they'll kick it upstairs. It'll go to a committee before it ever gets to the Secretary of Defense's office. But in between the time, even when they're deciding this might be worth doing, apparently it's handed over to a group that's called the Senior Review Group, non-delegable members. And in fact, the first reason I started looking into it was in the Wilson Davis memo, because one of the guys that's named in there, I believe it said he was a member or affiliated with the Senior Review Group. And this is a group that can actually has kind of, my understanding, yay or nay, okay, over which classified programs get finally set over on the desk of the Secretary of Defense to whether he decides to do it or not. But there's also a term I've heard called the Watch Committee. I've heard that the Watch
Kristen, what about the Avery Group? Have you heard about the Avery Group?
Well, that was back in the Bill Moore NJ12 period. And my understanding, maybe Don knows more about it since he was...
Some of those guys are still alive, though.
Yeah, but a lot of them seem to be the same guys.
Right.
Like Al, I think, is one of them, and some of these others. But I believe, correct me if I'm wrong, Don, that they were really more or less, that was a name that was applied by Bill Moore to these people he didn't necessarily want to name, so he gave them all these bird acronyms. And different ones had different acronyms. So if he's talking to people, that they'll know who he's talking about. So I don't believe that Avery was an official group of people. It was Bill's contacts.
And a lot of those guys were disinformation specialists.
Doty.
Being people like Doty. Collins. Okay. I had a headbutting incident with Bob Collins. He had sent me a copy of his book, and after we had a disagreement, he demanded I send it back. And I said, "Well, you can come out and pick it up if you want, Bob, but no, I'm not gonna spend the money to send it back to you."
Send it
well,
postage
I mean,
too.
I would have considered that. Yeah, that's kind of a pat on the back. You must have done something right if you got that angry.
Yeah.
No, but I'm telling you, I had butt-ins with Doty a few times, and well, let's just say there are two people that if they told me the sky was blue, I wouldn't automatically believe it. Doty is to this day.
And you see his face everywhere these days.
I was just going to say that, and you know, he agreed to be on my show about a year ago, and I said I would only want you on my show if I can ask you any questions, and that means about Paul Bennewitz as well. And I've invited him several times. He's, I can't, but I see him everywhere. He's on everyone else's show, but he won't come on my show because I'm going to confront him about Paul Bennewitz.
They already acknowledged that they did a disinformation campaign on Paul Bennewitz.
Believe me.
And that'll be coming up in the second hour. But, you know, we're about halfway through our first hour. And I do want to talk, if that's all right, we can jump right in and talk about this article. This, I guess you'd call it an op-ed. It's an opinion piece anyway. This came out with Sean Kirkpatrick, basically when he was leaving, when he left, actually. And he came out with this, and there's a lot of people talking about this right now. And some of his claims, when I spoke to Tim Burchett today, he's basically rolling his eyes like, and I outright asked Tim Burchett, do you think that AARO is a disinformation campaign? And he said, absolutely 100%. He didn't even hesitate on that. So I don't know if anyone wants to take away some of these claims or talk about some of these claims in this article, but the floor is open. Why don't we start with Chris DiPerno? Do you have anything to say about this article? Did you read it through?
Yeah, Kirkpatrick has always said there has never been any evidence of aliens. He said that in front of Senator, I think it's Kristen Gillibrand, who had a committee. He said right out, Senator, we have no information that these things are extraterrestrial or aliens. So way back, right from the first start, He says that. Then he says, "Oh, geez, we're not getting all the information that we should be getting," and yet people have come forward and said, "Yeah, we talked to this group. We've acknowledged all this." So I agree with Congressman Burchett. This was a big disinformation thing. Once again, as Don and I agree on, they want to send us down all these different roads so we have no idea. Now, one other thing I wanted to say about Kirkpatrick, what's Kirkpatrick do? He comes out and says that cube is now something of an enemy drone, probably from the Chinese. He has a that was the picture with the article that was there, is that he spotted this drone, this UFO that was spotted at a military base along the East Coast. May have been a high-tech enemy drone, says ex-Pentagon UFO investigator dubbed Dr. Evil. Now, how do you get a nickname of Dr. Evil? Kirkpatrick does, because he's been working on killing lasers and everything most of his time. So
that's right. Yeah.
And so now he comes out and says this is a Chinese drone. Now, why does all of a sudden when he leaves, he says this is a Chinese drone, as opposed that he didn't come out publicly while he was in the organization, as he was head of it, and says, "Hey, we've investigated this. We know it's a Chinese drone." It's all about disinformation. The UFO field has gotten so far with disinformation that they want people going in all kinds of directions, from demonic to the Chinese to what interdimensional.
Yes, and just real quickly, I wrote to Ryan Graves today. I was hoping to hear back from him, and he does generally write back. But I said I want to know your opinion of this, and because what he and his fellow pilots were reporting was a clear sphere, not this chrome thing, and also there was a cube inside of it. That's what they were seeing, and so this is also an alleged research drone type of thing. We don't even know if a thing flies. We don't really know anything about it. It's all alleged. And let's see, Don, what do you think about the whole thing?
I got to tell you, to begin with, number one, and to be perfectly honest, it's been a while since I've read that. A lot of that information, it's not real fresh with me, but I totally agree with Chris DiPerno. This thing is a disinformation surprise, okay? But hey, that's true with almost everything in this field these days. I half the time don't believe what I turn up when I'm researching something. I mean, the bottom line is, how do you verify this stuff? What's the bottom line on verification? And it's designed that way. It's been that way since, my God, 1947. And it's not going to change. But the business about we have no proof of alien incursions or that any aliens are here. We go back to the David Grush testimony in Congress on the 26th of July. And the one thing that I noticed and I picked up on immediately, everything that they have been talking about, okay, basically have been recent events. We have had a number of very well documented, going back to 1967, incidents where unidentified flying objects have not only invaded nuclear weapons sites, nuclear power plants, nuclear missile, sites, ballistic missiles, interfering with them to the point that they had to replace some of these missiles. We know about it. Barry Greenwood, Larry Foss had detailed it in their superb book, and not a mention of it. Most people today have absolutely no data on those events at all. They depend upon the passage of time. And let's face it, most people's attention spans are geared to the 24-hour news cycle. In 2 days, you don't even know what the hell they were talking about. Okay, 2 days later. Earlier this evening, my wife was watching local news here in LA, and they're talking about a series of shootings that happened, a year, 2 years ago. And I had to rack my brain. Hell, I'm a medically retired criminal investigator, and I knew about these things when they happened, but it just passed right out of my mind. So this kind of stuff, I don't mean to go on and on, but this kind of stuff is not shocking to me, not anymore.
Chris Lambright.
Well, I agree with what both gentlemen have said as far as that's concerned. Not knowing Kirkpatrick or what his interests were, why he even took the job, or whether he was put in the job to begin with. We also know, since you've talked about SAPs and the term unacknowledged SAPs, and then you go into the waived unacknowledged ones, you have to question, what does Kirkpatrick actually have access to? He may think he has access to all the information, but for the people, we talked about this a minute ago, there are people like Grush and these others who are claiming they went in and actually spoke with these committees. And now Kirkpatrick is coming out and saying they begged these people to come talk to him and they wouldn't come talk to him. And how can both be true? Unless Kirkpatrick wasn't in the room at the meeting time and nobody ever told him that they had gone in and talked. I mean, I'm obviously conjecturing on that, but the idea is those are somebody's either blatantly lying or we're missing the trick.
Sir, maybe Kirkpatrick himself is lying.
Could very well be. I mean, I don't know. I mean, unfortunately, I have a feeling there are people that I could name here who know that they are misrepresenting, if you want to be polite about it, their stories to the public. But either they've got a pension somewhere, or they've agreed ahead of time to hold the fort, so to speak, and not go against this normal line that we've been fed. And it may very well be that Kirkpatrick has got, he's got a get out of jail free card to say whatever he wants. And I will mention this too, because you mentioned it. He's now resigned, and now he can come out and say these things. I did a little quick look at all those people that were at To the Stars when it started. And if you'd looked closely at when those people actually resigned just before they went and joined To the Stars. I mean, Simivan supposedly had resigned. Even the Lockheed guy, I think he resigned like a few weeks. But I'm wondering sometimes whether ushering you out is a way to kind of give you space to do and say what you want without anybody being able to claim you're officially lying or saying other things. Or just now they can say they've washed their hands of you. I learned something about that when I was working on the book, The Story of what's called sheep dipping, where you get somebody and they supposedly resign from the military so they can go work for a contractor or do something else. And you don't know that they're really kind of still connected. But, Kirkpatrick can say what he wants. Everybody else says what they want. The proof is what we need. And in my opinion, none of these guys are whistleblowers, because if you really wanted to blow the whistle, you're going to blow it so people will come and see what you're blowing the whistle about. You don't clam up and claim I can't talk about it.
Well, here's the thing too about SAPs, like Thomas Wilson. Okay, after the Eric Davis fiasco, Wilson denied it to the nth degree. None of this is true. But the fact of the matter is, it's a federal felony under statute. If he has awareness of a program that's protected by an SAP, it's a felony for him to even acknowledge he's aware of it. So, by design, they have to lie. Even if they didn't want to lie, they have no choice.
Yeah, I have heard exactly that thing with a friend. Tom Bland working on a book and called his co-author who had a few things and asked him about something. And he's basically, I'm not even going to touch that. He won't even talk about it. And you're correct. And which does then make you wonder, how come all these other guys that are supposedly now coming out and talking about these programs that they knew about, and they seem to be going untouched? I mean, even Elizondo supposedly getting the 3 videos released and maybe giving them to Chris Mellon at some point. But other than some talk about AFOSI looking into it, they all seem to have just skated free on that. And that to me is a big concern, why you have some people claiming certain things that they knew and that are classified, but they're acknowledging, even Jim Simivan, who will claim, well, there's things he can't talk about, but then he'll go right off and make insinuations and suggestions and references to things. And you begin to think, isn't that doing exactly what you're doing? You know, you remember the old movie about Robert Redford and what was the Pentagon Papers or something anyway, where he asked the guy on the phone, he said, look, if I'm telling you something just that's true, don't answer, just don't say anything. And he holds on the phone for 10 seconds and then the guy goes, is that clear enough? So he didn't make a comment, but you got the word pretty quickly.
Kristen, here's the problem that I have with this article that Kirkpatrick puts out. And this just blows my mind. So he says, our efforts were ultimately overwhelmed by sensational but unsupported claims that ignored contradictory evidence, yet captured the attention of policymakers, the public driving legislative battles, dominating the public narrative. The results of this whirlwind of tall tales, fabrication, and secondhand or third-hand retelling of the same was a social media frenzy. So he's basically calling Commander Fravor a liar, which Commander Fravor is a direct evidence. Don knows and I know that's direct testimony. You're an eyewitness
there's
to
some
a phenomenon
about Fravor that I have serious questions about, and I've wanted and tried to get to Chris Mellon to ask him a question about something that I think is a paper trail that suggests to me we have not been told the actual facts of that particular case. I don't want to get off the topic here. We can talk about that a little bit later on.
Right, but what he's saying there is he's saying this is all tales.
Yeah. Well, I happen to think, and maybe like Don was in getting at earlier, the way I look at it is we, the public, are being treated like chickens in the chicken yard, and they're just throwing worms and seeds out here, and it doesn't matter what your flavor is. Whether you believe in demons or you're religiously oriented or you believe it's all man-made, they'll throw something out there to keep everybody distracted and shuffling around and going off in their own little areas and talking among each other. And it's almost like what they did in the Bennewitz case. You bring up Aquarius and MJ12, and you throw all these other things out there, and people scatter. Especially in the FOIA, it can take years. I've got some that don't come back. So I don't know how anybody's ever going to dispute what Kirkpatrick said, unless you could get them all together and everybody swears we were in that office. We told them directly all this for 4 hours. So for him to come out and claim that we're lying, fine, file a defamation suit. Let's see some real facts hit the road when you come at him for defamation, when they're obviously, unless he was the only one that was in the briefing, there must have been other people in the briefing that talked to these different people. So somebody else out there is going to be able to substantiate that. But the problem I see is Don's absolutely right. The attention span of people, because there's something new coming along. And need we talk about Jeremy Corbell and George Knapp, who seem every few months drop out another little something to get everybody chummed around and running around on that thing. And I'm honestly convinced, because of what I saw in the interview Corbell did with Fravor, that somehow Corbell got into this way back in 2013 or so, long before anybody thought he did. Because Fravor said, well, I've known you 8 years now? And this was like, I thought, wait a minute. Corbell is looking like this while he's talking. And you realize he is not wanting that to be acknowledged. But needless to say, they're getting their tidbits of information handed to them. And I'm afraid there are enough people out here. I am seriously concerned even about Grush, because I've got what I consider almost irrefutable information. Although it's come out now that Eric Davis had been apparently, and we know he's been telling things to Joe Merja every now and then. But now Eric Davis has come out and acknowledged that he's kind of was one of the guys who apparently had been talking to Grush to begin with. But
what about Hal Puthoff?
Well, Hal Puthoff may have been in there. I know Hal. that's a whole different scenario. But Eric Davis and Hal Puthoff, I have a picture. Eric Davis has said that he met Grush back 2019, 2020, somewhere back then. And he mentored Grush, and he showed Grush the way to get to the unacknowledged programs, something to that effect. Now,
I gotta pop in here for a quick second. Let me throw a real curveball. Okay, this is a curveball.
Okay.
But speaking about Hal Puthoff, and this paper I wrote a number of months ago. Okay, part of it dealt with the fact of the remote viewing program that the DIA and the CIA financed for 20 years. I personally knew and was friends with Ingo Swann, the guy that designed the protocols. And when I was looking into this entire thing with Stanford Research and all the usual names that were involved with that, Christian, I noticed a lot of those guys were involved with the Church of Scientology. Now, we all know today, we know that one of their stars, Pat Price, okay, was stealing classified reports of things that he was involved in, Swan, all these other people, okay, and feeding them to the Church of Scientology. And we found that out when the IRS raided the Church of Scientology. Church of Scientology at that time had a real ongoing feud with the federal government. I don't want to get totally sidetracked with that, but there is some very interesting things in there. But the bottom line was, Puthoff was deeply involved with Scientology, okay, when he was doing his laser stuff and a lot of other things. Now, that would make, I think, a very interesting research effort. Do you got any thoughts about that?
Well, I mean, at all times, be nice if you can. I've read a lot about what you're talking about with Pat Price and Hal and those kind of things. And I read a small blurb somewhere that referenced where Hal Puthoff had apparently written sounding very positive about Scientology.
Well, he was a part of it.
Yeah, that's the thing. There have been other times, though, that I've seen things, and I don't have them in front of me to go into them now, that have made me wonder, could some of these individuals, whether it's Hal or any of the other ones, have been kind of infiltrating Scientology to get information and feeding it back through to whomever else. So everybody seems to reference Hal having been a part of Scientology or a member of Scientology, and Hal seems to be kind of quiet on that aspect of it. And I don't know why that is. Is it because he doesn't want to, which is fair game. If he doesn't want to talk about it, fair enough. Or is it because there was something else actually going on as for why he was so, or had gotten involved with Scientology at the time? I mean, if Pat Price was feeding information, I've read that, I don't know that for a fact, but if Pat Price was feeding information to Scientology, why wouldn't the other side want to get somebody inside of their own to figure out who in Scientology is trying to pick the brains of Pat Price and get him this information?
Wasn't Pat Price found dead in a motel room?
Yeah.
Under suspicious circumstances?
Yeah, it's believed
he was a top remote viewer at one point.
He was one of the very top. But the problem was, at that time, he and Ingo Swann and others were doing a lot of spying on Soviet facilities, okay? And there's a contingent of researchers that believe he may have been assassinated by the KGB.
Well, the KGB were doing the same thing with remote viewing, but there always was a story out there that they were actually able. Remember that movie, The Men That Stare at Goats?
Oh, sure.
All right, but they, at some point, there was a story that the Soviets were actually be able to perfect that through remote viewing, to actually create heart attacks and stuff. That's what their goal was at one point.
Well, it's believed that he was, if in fact he was assassinated. It was kind of like that guy from I think it was Bulgaria that was whacked by the umbrella guy that
the
fired
radiation.
a pellet into his
Yeah.
leg, and it may have been something like that, because Hal Puthoff was supposed to meet Pat Price there. And Puthoff, this is another little oddity, okay, a little quirky thing. Puthoff found him. The body.
There's that. Yeah, I
Okay.
didn't realize that.
Oh, wow.
So yeah, they're hey, look. The tangled web we weave when we attempt to deceive. I mean,
And there's the thing. A lot of this stuff, there will never be an end to it. I mean, unless somebody came up and admitted and had all the details of how it occurred. How do you really know? I mean, I read the strange mysteries surrounding Pat Price's death, and there was some oddities to it, but where's, it's like so many things that are being said about ufology right now, about Jim Simivan talking about it's the jinn or it's some spiritual thing, which that just
Well, let me ask you this, Mr. Lambright. I have a question for you, sir. Why would the Pentagon come out and tell a high-ranking person like Lou Elizondo? Now, I'm not saying that this is it. I'm just curious as to why they would go to Lou Elizondo and say, drop this case because we know what it is and it's all demonic. And then we have the Collins group within the Pentagon that's formed that believe that this is all demonic. So why are they, that particular narrative, I'm curious your idea why they would push.
Well, you open up a can of worms with me on that one, because a lot of my thoughts along this line.
That's
really,
what this show's about, is open up cans of worms.
Really is more.
Oh yeah.
my opinion, for what it's worth right now, is the real problem with ufology isn't the UFOs. It's people. It's us. Everybody has their own belief, what I call their preferred belief. And in fact, I wish people would listen more carefully to words, because there is a word belief, then there's the word think, and then there's facts, what you know. Many people will just say they know something, and it really is something they believe. They don't have, it's like an opinion. You don't necessarily have to have any real evidence for it. You're entitled to believe whatever you want. And I'm afraid there are going to be people, whether it's in the Pentagon or anywhere else in the world, that for reasons of their own, either they've been, we've all been indoctrinated all our lives into things that have end up affecting what we believe. And if you're a strongly religious person and fear comes into play because you don't know what the unknown means, I think there will be people who will decide it's demonic. Just like even before the Pentagon, I'm sure we had plenty of people looking at flying saucers and claiming it's the devil. And these days, if you don't want to become religiously, shifty on it, I think it's this no different than saying it's spiritual or it's the jinn or it's something else. I'll tell you guys something I've never told. Well, I may have told one or two other people before because I don't want to get into it, but it's one of the reasons that I am extremely hesitant when people claim that they've seen things and they are absolutely certain that it's real. I grew up in Southeast Asia, in Java, Indonesia. My parents were missionaries. And let me finish the whole story here. One night, I'm sleeping. I had to be 10 years old or less. Of course, I wasn't raised in the States at the time, so I didn't know. We got 3 minutes to a break.
Yeah, but we'll have them do this story after the break.
I'll make it quick. I woke up in my bed and looked out the window. There was a garden out there, but it was walled in. And I swear to this day, I can still see it. Bela Lugosi is the Frankenstein monster. I mean, the quintessential flathead, everything, walking along. And I was panicked. And I ducked down thinking, if he looks at me, he's going to see it. As soon as I looked back up again, I saw the back of his head going the other way. The real point of the story is, like 2 days before that, my father had received a model of the Frankenstein monster from my uncle, who had sent it to us all the way in Java, put it all together, and it was the quintessential Bela Lugosi Frankenstein monster. I'd never thought or seen or really heard anything about it, but I am fully aware even then it was more like a waking dream or whatever you want to call it, that I saw something. But if I had said it was a little gray alien, how would I explain it away? How would I be able to contest that? If I had said it was a demon in the room, a dark shadow in my room? But fortunately, it was the model I had known my dad had gotten and finished putting it all together, and that's where the idea came from. So I know it wasn't real. But the human
Actually,
mind,
I read something about Frankenstein walking around that
Oh,
area
boy,
at that
don't
time.
tell me.
Yeah.
I knew it. You just wiped me out, Martin. No, but my point is, I am well aware, if only from that personal experience, that the human mind can project or can create, and depending upon the state of mind that you're in and your willingness to believe what you've seen is
You
something.
talking about a toll?
Well, I don't know what people want to call things these days, but I'm just saying anything somebody sees, you need to be sure. When you talk about UFOs, people see a little light go by, and because they don't know what it is, it immediately qualifies. I wouldn't qualify it that way. To me, the term UFO needs more breakdowns. You have to be able to identify something, even if it's specifics. But nowadays, the whole thing is just a free-for-all, just like changing from extraterrestrial to interdimensional. It's just another
Well,
word.
I have to tell you, Chris, we're just about going right into the break here. But when I saw my UFO go over me, the perfect shaped saucer, I don't know how many years it had been when it had even thought about a flying saucer or UFO. So I don't know. I do understand what you're saying, though, and you're making a good point. But right now, we're going to have to go into the break. And when we come back, we're going to be talking about Paul Bennewitz. And Chris, you can finish your thoughts on that and go right into the Paul Bennewitz case when we come back. Thank you. We'll be right back.
Hey members, the new KGRA DB app is now available on iOS and Android devices. Gain on-demand access to any KGRA DB programming. Download any show directly to your mobile device to listen or watch on the go. Go to the App Store and search KGRA DB.
You're listening to the KGRA Digital Broadcasting Network. We provide unparalleled coverage of trending news in the world of ufology, cryptozoology, and paranormal phenomenon. Whether you're watching our video live stream or listening to one of our audio programs, you are getting the best from world-renowned researchers and hosts, guiding you through topics the mainstream won't touch. Miss one of your favorite programs? No problem. Head over to the members area at kgradb.com for access to our massive library of award-winning content. Make contact, stay connected, only at kgradb.com.
And we're back. And this hour, we'd like to talk a lot about the Paul Bennewitz case. Kristen Lambright, I met you years ago after I'd heard you talk on, I believe it was Coast to Coast. I reached out to you and asked you to be a guest.
I do owe George that for that one.
Yeah, that was a long time ago. I think back in 2012 or 13 when we first started talking. And you had written Ex Descending about the Paul Bennewitz case. And this is a case of disinformation, of torture, basically, of a brilliant man. And for the person that is unaware of the Paul Bennewitz case, I'd like for you to kind of present it in like a nutshell of like within 10 minutes, if you can possibly. And did you have something to finish up on your thoughts from right before we went into break, or were we basically done?
Not that it was important to. I'm sure we'll go off in all sorts of interesting tangents here in a little bit. So we'll just carry on with what it is.
All right. And I do have to say there's a lot of interest in this case. There has been for a long time. And I'll bring up a picture. I think it's really curious, Christian, that there's not a lot of pictures of Paul Bennewitz, and there's not any really good picture that I was ever able to find. Here's a picture that you see out there a lot.
That's from UFO magazine.
Is it really? Yeah. And why is that? Why aren't there more pictures of Paul Bennewitz? Do you know?
I don't know. The most recent one or not recent one, but another one that I had seen is the one that seems to be shown now. Emily Louise, that I put you in touch with the other day, had a picture of him where he's got a beard. And I don't know whether that was before or after the one that we're seeing here, but it's an interesting looking picture in its own right for the guy running his own scientific lab. But yeah, I have a feeling they're probably out there somewhere. I mean, maybe Gabe Valdez or Greg Valdez may have some images left over because Paul had spent a good amount of time with Gabe. But I don't know why there aren't as many out there as you would think, considering the interest that's been in his case. At least after it occurred, you had a good 10 years up to the point that Bill Moore gave his speech in Las Vegas. But even then, if it wasn't for Paul Bennewitz's case, we wouldn't be hearing from Doty, although he talks about everything else under the sun these days. But that's where he came from. People think about MJ-12, and if it wasn't for the Paul Bennewitz case, we wouldn't have even had that out there, or the Project Aquarius, or any of these sorts of things. There's so many things that tie back into that particular case that in itself, to me, is one of the reasons I'm not sure why congressmen these days aren't shown information on that case. And let's get some of the Air Force people. Of course, this was when the Air Force was really involved. Nowadays, they seem to have sat back and let the Navy take all the hits.
Yeah, that's right.
There are aspects of that case that are, you cannot explain them away. And the way things occurred and the consequences. In this case, it's more like, he called the Air Force to tell them what he'd seen, thinking he was doing the right thing. And even in it may have been one of the videos that Doty had given an interview in where he says, Paul was a patriot. He always hung his flag out. And I'm like, and this is the guy that you're saying you went after. You're saying he was a good American, and you and your whoever was giving your orders back then at AFOSI decided to go after and try to rub this guy into the ground. So anyway, I can give you a short version of what occurred with Paul.
Why don't you? Yeah.
Sure. Okay. Paul was a gentleman that lived just to the east side and called the Four Hills area of Albuquerque, which if you've ever seen the map of the area, it's on a bit of a rise up there, which means from his roof, he had a clean view down towards the line. You could see the Albuquerque airport and look pretty much straight across the fence line, because there's not very far to the fence, of Kirtland Air Force Base. And the mountains, the 3 miles that are called the Manzano Mountains, where there were bunkers had been drilled in and supposedly nuclear materials had been stored in there. Back at that time, it was considered one of the most secure places in the United States because it had a double perimeter electrified fence that went around the whole 3 mile long mountains and then patrolled by guards and whatever. Paul had gotten interested in UFOs and apparently had been for quite some time. He had already been in touch with the AARO, Jim and Coral Lorenzen, but around 1979, my book focuses primarily on about a 1 year period from middle of 1979 to the middle of 1980, because after that, my feeling was all bets are off because they knew what was going on and you don't happen to know what kind of disinformation was out. But he had gotten interested in the reports of cattle mutilations and strange things going on in the area around Dulce. In fact, people who hear about Dulce to this day may not make the connection that this all basically had its beginnings with the underground bases stories with Paul Bennewitz. But to make a long story short, he got very interested because of something he caught on film, and he'd been going back and forth to Dulce. But one night he came back. It was, best I could tell, it was maybe around the middle of December. He had come back from being up there, and his wife told him that she'd been waked up in the middle of like 4 o'clock in the morning with a dog barking from some loud noise over their home. And I guess it was his mindset at the time. He wondered, was there something else now that may have followed him back? And he didn't quite know what. The point was that made him get out on the roof of his house. Keep in mind, it's freezing. We're talking sometimes down in the 20-degree temperatures, but he's up on the roof of his house, which was a 2-story house to begin with. When he gets up on the top, he's like on the 3rd floor up there, looking out where he's got a pretty much clear view straight across the plain above the fences out towards the Manzanos. And one of these nights, while he's out there looking, he sees this strange glow way off in the distance, about a mile, 2 miles off towards the plains. And as he watches this strange glow, suddenly at one point, there was a bright flash, instant whoosh. And a few seconds later, boom, brilliant came on, and objects shot straight up off the ground to maybe 300 feet, and then took off south, a beeline around the south end of the mountains. Shocked the daylights out of him. But after that, he got a camera. By that time, I think he had a Hasselblad camera. The best I can tell is he also had another camera mounted on a telescope, and another one that I think had a lens on it that gave him 6 degrees, something this way. But he had 3 different types of photography equipment out there, cameras equipment out there. And as he stayed out there, the best I can tell, it may not have been every night in a row, but one night when he was out there, he wrote in some papers that I still have, actually not far from here, that his wife came out on the deck with him. And they were watching, because he was watching these. By this time, he had seen these lights down there, the glow that he first identified. And they saw what appeared to be, I guess they speculated it must be the guard's truck driving down the side road by the perimeter fences. And she couldn't understand, how can they not see these things? But shortly afterwards, he saw that flash that he had recognized the first time, and he told her, get ready and watch. And apparently she was right there with him. These things took off, shot down around the south end of the mountain. But he had not ever gotten out there early enough, apparently, to see them come in. But one night he describes he had gotten out there much earlier, and at a certain point, in this case, he only describes one, so I'm not sure if it was, there were 4, let me put it that way. I should have backed that up and said that. 4 of these objects to begin with, 3 smaller ones, one about twice the size of the other ones. And this time he only described one of them that came around the end of the mountain very fast. And from where he was and where he had presumed they were going down, it would have been about a mile from the south end of the mountain to zip around and come up to the area where he had seen them go down. And he said it didn't come in like a helicopter at all. It came in right over the spot, stopped, went straight down, lights out within 5 seconds. No hovering and finding where you're going to come down like a helicopter would have done. And that was the time when he presumes this is where they're coming in from. Somehow or other, they're coming in from the south edge of the mountain, which later on, you hear a lot of talk. I think Bruce Maccabee even wrote about this idea of Coyote Canyon, which Coyote Canyon was actually on the other side of the Manzano Mountain Ridge. So you could not see into Coyote Canyon from where Paul's house was. And just so anybody is not confused, the Starfire optical range, which was also out there on the grounds of Kirtland, is about another 2 or 3 miles further south behind the mountaintop from where Paul was. So people, I've heard Greg Bishop for one, said originally that, well, some people thought it may have been those lasers from the Starfire optical range, but they're on the other side of the mountain. You wouldn't have seen them for where Paul was seeing these things. But he got film footage and he got still shots. Where the still shots ever went, at one point, long after he had cut off communication with everybody, I wrote a letter to his wife and I said, all I can ask is if you've still got any of the material he had taken, please lock it away somewhere safe, just in case it ever comes up into value later on. But I was going to give a talk at a MUFON group in Dallas at that time. I guess I invited. And at the time, I'd been in communication with Paul. And he sent me a box about 2 or 3 inches thick, a FedEx box, with mounted black boards with 8x10 color photos mounted on it, including an original small Polaroid slide, that used to slide out of the camera. That was one of the first pictures that he took. I don't know why he sent that to me. I was careful with him. But that was one of the first pictures he took up in Dulce that showed an object by a tree. And if you look closely at it, you can make out some kind of geometric shape to it. But that's what really kicked his interest into gear, and that's why he ended up down in Albuquerque on the roof. But these photos that he took shows, one or two of them show an object when it's on the ground, very dark, but you can see a lighted band of, looks like rim lights in a circle around it. And then later on, when they took off, he's got images of them taking off with some kind of a strange, like static discharge of some sort. But he outlined and wrote about all of this stuff in the papers he sent me, and he sent me those photos. And obviously, the crazy thing is that about that time is when John Lear had come into the picture. And I didn't want to give up those photos to anybody, but John Lear had ingratiated himself to Paul, and I wanted to send them back to Paul. Paul kept saying, well, just give them to John, because John Lear wanted to take them. And I think it's subsequently to that is when John Lear, I think, is what part, in my opinion, is why Paul Bennewitz just fell off and went off the deep end, because he was so angry the last time I talked to him, yelling about John Lear. He felt betrayed for something. But the photos that I've got are clear enough. Now, I will say he took these photos off of one of the old 8mm, editor little machines that we all used to have before computers came into play. And you can see them on the screen. And in some cases, you can even see the reel to reel. So it's 8mm film, because you can see the reel there while he's taking the photo of it. But because it was taken at night, and of course, the pictures weren't perfectly clear, so I had to go into Photoshop and take out the orange coloration of the background of the image and darken that. But when you do that, the actual brightness of the images of the objects themselves come out. And I'm just saying it's not anything special to do. Anybody could do it. And I did not, you have to know, I didn't add anything into those pictures. I didn't take anything out. You're just adjusting contrast and some of that so that you can bring out the brightness of the objects. Those objects, there are things that you can see in there. One of them, when they're on the ground, the small object seems to suddenly shoot what a solar flare looks like. You can see in the glow around the top of this object, and they look kind of like a derby hat. It wasn't a perfectly round glow. It was more of a flattened off across the bottom and a big glow across the top. And very often when they're getting ready to move, there's a much bluer tint towards one side than the other. But in the one smaller object, when it's taken off, as the glow comes on, you get rid of the orange glow, and inside you can see these red tendrils that look like solar flares almost. Makes me wonder, is this some kind of a magnetic field or something going on? I'd be speculating to tell you that. But those photos that Paul got, that's why he got in so much hot water. And it's notable that the Air Force didn't go to him and try to study the photos. They went after Paul. They did everything they could do to defuse Paul, because he had credibility, because not only was he a civilian, but he owned Thunder Scientific Lab that had contracts with some of the military agencies or departments at the time. So the guy was a very credible person as far as that goes. But that went on for 10 years. And my belief personally is they took his interest in Dulce and shifted him back up there by planting ideas of underground bases and then flying him over there with a helicopter and looking at things that are on the ground that I probably believe were planted there so they could point to them and make him feel like, oh, there must be an underground base down there. And that's why so much of what people talk about Paul Bennewitz, is Krista Tilton's book, and a lot of other stories that are written up have now gone to the idea of an underground base. But my opinion, it was the films that he got that if anybody saw them would have been irrefutable that he got something on film that was not, as in fact, I've heard somebody you would all know say, oh, it was just helicopters made up to, lights on helicopters. Not a chance in hell, not a chance. But anyway, that's what led him to call down on the base himself. And he got in touch with Colonel Ernest Edwards. I think he was Major Sergeant at the time. And he wanted to talk to him about these things he had filmed. And Ernest Edwards was actually in charge of security inside the perimeter fence on the mountaintop. But since these things were landing outside the perimeter fence, Edwards didn't know what to do. So he made the call to the AFOSI officer, who was Richard Doty, and put him in touch with Richard Doty. And that's, to me, when the whole fix was in. Once they knew that he had what he had on film, what are you going to do? And I guess they were going to do everything they could to demean his credibility and diminish him and fill him well, like even Bill Moore, I think, said they stuffed him so full of disinformation that he'd practically choke on it. But he believed these guys. He trusted them, right? They were the military guys. He was a patriot. He trusted. Why would they come after him and try to stick it to him? And I think,
sir, do you think he had some problems before that, though? I mean, there was some bizarre things that were happening. I know there was a disinformation case, probably. I don't know. I would like you, if you know about the Myrna Hansen situation, if you could talk about that, because that some people believe that's a disinformation case.
And I think it was. And in fact, I really tried to do a deeper dive into that in the book that I wrote, because I will say I didn't hear about Paul when it was first occurring in 1980. I don't know that many people did outside of Jim and Coral Lorenzen at AARO, whoever else, Paul might have been talking to directly, maybe Gabe Valdez or whomever. It was within a year or two after that, and I think Linda Howe had gotten into it, and then you had Bill Moore coming into play. One of the important points to remember, though, is Bill Moore got into this very early, like in the fall of 1980. For some reason, he had gone to Tucson. I'll get to Myrna Hansen here in 1 second. Bill had supposedly pulled up roots and moved to Arizona, to Tucson, and had begun to talk to, maybe it wasn't Tucson, but he began to talk to Jim and Coral Lorenzen with AARO. And one of the points to remember is he had joined them and it became kind of their head of special investigations, something to that effect. Right at about the time that was occurring in the spring of 1980, right after Paul Bennewitz had gotten his films, and I think it's notable that in all the documentation I've ever seen, Paul called the Air Force in January. He talked to Ernest Edwards and Doty in January, but you don't see any documentation about any of Doty talking to Paul until you suddenly get to around April and May, when Leo Sprinkle shows up and all of a sudden Myrna Hansen comes into the picture.
Right.
Now, the story of how she even came into the picture is almost a lure back to the Dulce scenario. Now, as far as Paul having had maybe any emotional or psychological issues before that, in the times I talked to him, by that time, of course, he was full of interesting ideas about aliens and this and that. And alien pragmatism is a word he used to use. And I remember to this day wondering, where did that ever come up? However, I think the Myrna Hansen story, my point is also, she apparently was a woman who had a child. Her story was she was driving
had a son
driving back across northern New Mexico. She apparently lived much farther to the eastern side of New Mexico. I don't remember the name of the town right now, but she is claimed, and apparently when she got home to wherever she was going, this is a story that I don't have exact proof of facts on this, but the story I've understood was she apparently got concerned about what she claimed had occurred to her, and she called one of the police departments or some officer where she was. By that time, Gabe Valdez was already widely known as being the man in the area about cattle mutilations and about aliens, UFOs, and whatnot. And he was over there on the western side.
He was friends with Bennewitz, correct?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, because when Bennewitz first heard about the cattle mutilation and stuff, there was a conference that went on. I think it was the Colorado Bureau of Investigation. Don may remember some of this. That went on. That took place either in southern Colorado or northern Mexico, but it was in the Dulce area. That's where Paul, because he was with AARO, had gone up there and been there. His name is on a list of people who had attended, but he met Gabe Valdez there. And when Paul drove back up, he rode around on a night ride with Gabe Valdez. And on that night ride, they apparently saw some very peculiar things, which is why the next day or next morning before Paul left, he took a photo of the area where they had been driving. And that's the photo that shows a tall pine tree and some unusual thing in the upper corner of it. That I think when he got home and showed it, his wife may have pointed it out to him, and that kind of lit the fire under him. That's why later on, when Myrna Hansen apparently reported something to a police department wherever she was located, they didn't know what to do with it. But it
was Eagle Nest, New Mexico, and it's she saw two large crafts that looked like Goodyear blimps. and I think they brought in Leo Sprinkle, correct, to do
That's my
hypnotic
understanding.
regression on her.
My understanding is she called her police department. They only knew Gabe Valdez was kind of into the whole cattle mutilation thing, because I believe her sighting also seemed to see a craft lifting up a cow or somehow interacting with a cattle. They referred her to Gabe Valdez. Gabe Valdez mentioned her to Paul. And my understanding is it was like in no time, maybe within a matter of few weeks, somehow she ends up all the way down staying at Paul's house.
Right.
I don't know why, but a single mother, to me, I have no indication that her son was with her. I always thought that's really unusual to think of a single mother just going down to some strange man's home and staying there for however long it was there, that then Leo Sprinkle shows up and Leo Sprinkle is doing the regressive hypnosis. I don't know what I think necessarily about
the one thing that was reported by Dr. Sprinkle was that the first hypnotic regression, Bennewitz and Hansen insisted that they do it in a garage in a Lincoln Town car, and that they put aluminum foil all over the windows.
I believe that, yes, I think that did take place, as bizarre as it sounds. Now, I don't know if that was the first time or second time. I do know
that's the first time, sir. And the second time when Dr. Sprinkle went down, he met Bennewitz. Bennewitz was armed to the teeth because he says the aliens are coming for me.
Well, that's what I've read. You know, and on all honesty, without being able to have Bennewitz to go ask about, or even Bennewitz's family to know about, I will say, the one time I finally went to Albuquerque and met Paul, yeah, he was very stressed out.
Here's my question to you. I do believe there was a disinformation campaign against Bennewitz, and I think you're on the right track. Only I'm wondering if they didn't start feeding him some kind of drugs. Because his bizarre behavior, because he actually turned on his wife too. He said his wife was being controlled by aliens and stuff. And it sounds like he was having some kind of psychotic effects. And I'm just throwing that out there.
Well, for what it's worth.
Yeah.
I had contact with Bennewitz then prior to his death. And he was of the firm belief that the aliens, the quote unquote aliens, had injected him with drugs. Now, with that being said, Bill Moore, okay, on one of those brunches that we periodically had, I questioned him deeply about that. And he told me that he was periodically going over to Bennewitz's house. And that's, of course, when he fed him those disinformation documents. Paul had firearms in all corners of his house, okay? And Moore, now, I never knew whether I believed this or not, but he had a very interesting anecdote that he told me, that he was there one time when he saw a floating, I believe Moore said it was a blue ball, pass behind Paul Bennewitz, okay? And he sat there and counted the number of cigarettes that Paul smoked in a 45-minute time period. 28 cigarettes. He would light one up, puff on it a little bit, put it out, immediately light another one up, puff on it a while, put it out. And I'm thinking to myself, Moore, what kind of a son of a bitch could you be, knowing that you were part of this process, driving this man crazy, and sit there and calmly count how many times he lit a cigarette in 45 minutes, and then report back to Doty to let them, I guess, know how their operation was going on. One more thing that Moore told me, that AFOSI had sent black bag people into his house periodically when Paul wasn't there and do things like rearrange his furniture to make him think that the aliens had been there. So, I mean, you know.
No, I mean, I I was about to say the exact same kind of thing, that the reports that we've read of people going in there, and Doty, I think at one point even suggested Paul was willing to let Doty go in there. I'm not sure if I buy that. I mean, what better way to say you didn't break in than to say the guy who can no longer vouch for you was allowing you to go in. But I remember Paul talking about those glowing balls, and that if they touched your skin, they'd sting the crap out of you. And I remember one time when I was working on the book, I called and talked to Linda Howell, because she'd been there early on, was involved in kind of this stuff really before it became well known. And she said that at one point she had been somewhere where Paul and his wife were there, and like they had their sleeves rolled up, and she saw these little marks, like little cut scrape marks all over their arms, and asked what those were. And he said, that's where those little glowing balls, if they touch you, they'll burn those little marks on you. And I was like, what you just described, Bill Moore having claimed he saw, and those kind of things, and Paul ultimately having suspicions that there was a house across the street that he'd see cars going in and out of. He didn't know. Of course, by this time, paranoia could be taken over. You don't know who to trust. But what could have caused the appearance of a glowing ball was really one of the reasons in my book I got really interested in Kirtland Air Force Base being called the Directed Energy Directorate. Because, for example, people who have got cancer treatments, well, they don't want to hit you with a high strength beam, so they line two of them up so that the intersection point is where you're going to actually get the effect. And I began to wonder, could there have been some way, especially if black bag teams went in there and laid out his whole house, that you could have directed energy beams that would cross at a certain point, and you'd suddenly have this glowing plasma. If you've ever been outside of a solar facility out in the country where they have all the mirrors pointing towards the top of the receiver, you'll see a glowing ball of plasma almost, because all those mirrors are focusing the sun's intensity on that one spot. That's conjecture, of course, on my part, but I did look into some of the things that were going on at Kirtland, and a group called the Scorpions, and I kind of struck me the idea that, what do you say when a scorpion hits you? He stings you. And I found some documentation on it about an energy rifle that had the logo of a scorpion on it that was being experimented with by these Scorpworks guys, where they could hit you with a high intensity beam for what purpose, who knows? But it just seemed to me to be interestingly coincidental, if nothing else, that right across the fence from where Paul lives, you've got the Directed Energy Directorate working on these beams that conceivably might hit people. And
Sir, he must have had something very important, because if I remember right, he was in constant contact with Gabe Valdez, who was a police officer, right?
Quite a bit from my understanding.
All right, and Gabe Valdez's son reports that they found all kinds of listening devices in the police officer's home.
Yeah.
So obviously they must have been talking about something that was quite interesting to the military, or something they wanted to keep them away from there. Because you don't break into a cop's home and put listening devices in without something very, very, very important.
Yeah, or perhaps they're wanting to see what effect. My thinking has been, the best way to get Paul to sound crazy is to stuff him full of aliens are attacking from all over the place, and then there's underground bases at Dulce, and it's clear that they did fly up there with helicopters at times, even after the meeting that took place in November that reported the case where they had Paul down on the base. Ernest Edwards told me that right after that meeting, some people got in helicopters and headed up there towards Dulce. But if Paul was being fed information, especially like with Myrna Hansen, to reinforce his belief that, yes, there's an underground base up there at Dulce, and she must have been close to it, you might want to monitor whatever he's saying and talking to Gabe Valdez and be able to see how effective it's going on. Or maybe you give information to Gabe Valdez as well that makes him think Paul is onto something. I don't know, but it's clear that there was some kind of a disinformation, mind manipulation going on with Paul that began because of the films that he took. in the last 20, 30, 40 years, if you call the Air Force and asked anything, they'd say, call MUFON. They would just refer you to something else. Go ahead.
Yeah. Christian, am I recalling right that there was maybe an unsubstantiated rumor that J. Allen Hynek visited him and gave him a computer with something on it that he thought he could communicate with aliens or something like that?
Well, one of the things that actually, I think there were some photos that were taken or images that were taken that he shared with Gabe Valdez actually were from an early computer system. And I believe it's in Greg Bishop's book that the story begins to first come out, that apparently Paul either wanted a computer system or was in a position where some Hynek could give him one. But the story was that Hynek gave him a computer, but didn't tell him that it actually came from the Air Force. Now, what was on there? I don't know, but that seems to have been the computer that Paul would be using when he thought he was somehow able, and apparently by all accounts, from what I understand, he was kind of an electrical genius, being able to devise little contraptions of his own. But he managed to set up some kind of rudimentary communication thing that he felt was allowing him to communicate with whoever these aliens were that were out towards Kirtland or wherever else. And at times he would get images that almost looked like, I mean, this was even before my computer time, I think, some rudimentary, pixelated images of pictures of different things that the aliens were supposedly sending to him. And I know my friend Tom Bland had seen some of those. He knew Gabe Valdez very well and had shown him some of the pictures that Paul apparently had printed out off of the computer. But the idea, and I don't know, that's always bothered me. Keep in mind, that's hearsay. Hynek's not around now for anybody to go ask him about it. But the idea that Hynek would knowingly give a computer to Paul, but not tell him that it came from the Air Force. And I don't even know necessarily what year we're talking about. Was this a lot of
Hynek was still associated with the Air Force in those days. According to Moore, I interviewed Moore in June of 1994. I interviewed him a number of times, but on that particular broadcast, he claimed that Moore claimed that Vallée and Hynek were still both feeding intel back to the Air Force. In other words, they were spooks. And I said, no, wait a minute. He said, I can prove it. I said, well, you're making one heck of an allegation there, Bill. He said, well, I have the proof. I said, did you bring it? He said, no. I said, I need to see that proof. He said, I'll bring it to you in a week. Well, that was the last time I ever had any communication with Bill Moore.
Something tells me in the last year or so, somebody published an account of that. I didn't realize that was you that he had talked to. But yeah, that kind of thing is, I don't even know what to think of Bill Moore. The only reason that I feel, or strongly feel, that Moore was not just a writer who somehow the Air Force decided to try to pull him in, was the timing of when he became the AARO head of their science, investigations, whatever else. And that was almost in no time before the odd Craig Wetzel letter was sent to AARO. And supposedly Jim Lorenzen hands it to Bill Moore to investigate, and he says he never did. But that's the letter that you first see Doty's name mentioned.
Don't forget, 79 was when Moore's book came out on Roswell.
Yeah, made him a big character, so to speak, a big popular. And
that's allegedly, according to what he later told me, is when the government, AIFO, contacted him. And his thought, and he told me this distinctly, he said, look, I was bound and determined to get into the middle of the beehive. I wanted to know, and it was obvious to me. I mean, hell, in my career, I've interviewed, I couldn't tell you how many thousands of people, and I can generally read somebody pretty well. And Moore, his arrogance came out. He was convinced he was smarter than those guys. And he wasn't bending to their will. They were bending to his. This was his attitude.
Yeah,
And
well,
look what it got him.
surprising. The interesting thing, though, is, see, I'd never heard him stating that they had contacted him in 1979. I wouldn't necessarily.
Well, right after the book came out, it could have been 80, Christian.
Because his story that I heard was that it was after he was on a book tour, I think, and he was going across country, and he began to get calls at the radio stations by people saying, "We think you're the guy, the only guy who we've heard who knows what he's talking about." And it was on one of his return drives in Albuquerque where he supposedly got a contact to meet somebody at one of the restaurants, and somebody tapped on his window. He supposedly was sitting out waiting to see who walks into the restaurant, and a guy with a red carnation or something to this effect taps on his window, and that's when he went and met this person who he talked to first. And then within a couple of weeks, he's introduced to Richard Doty. And I'm like, that's interesting that he's getting these calls according to what he says, but it sounds like a convenient cover story, because if he was working with AARO and they gave him that Craig Wetzel letter, that I talked to Craig Wetzel, something occurred, but not everything that was in there. The Craig Wetzel letter was the first one that mentions Doty, spelled D-O-D-Y, but they gave that letter to Bill Moore, and Bill Moore says he never checked on it. But then suddenly he's on a book tour, and on one of his return trips, he meets this guy who then puts him in touch with Doty, the very same person who was mentioned in the paper, but he's supposed to be their head investigator guy, and he never checked on it. But Doty gets in, and that's the best I knew, is that's when all of this started.
Mr. Lambright,
later. Yes, sir.
The question I have for you, what was it that Bennewitz filmed? What base was it that he filmed a UFO for? He filmed something over
Kirtland Air Force Base, right there in Albuquerque.
Was that a weapons storage facility? Because I believe somewhere is that he filmed something over a weapons storage facility.
Well, I don't know that he filmed anything directly over the weapons storage facility. If you look at Google Maps, you'll see the relationship between Kirtland and Kirtland Air Force Base and the 3 miles of what are called the
Kirtland is supposed to have a weapons storage facility, correct?
Well, that's what's if what I'm thinking is what you're referring to in the mountains, the the Manzano mountain range, which originally had the double perimeter electrified fence around it, has had tunnels drilled into it with big bunkers out front that supposedly had nuclear materials and whatnot in there. That double perimeter fence, though, also has a road where the guards would drive along, the road they would use if you were going to one of the bunkers and that sort of thing. The objects that Paul filmed, though, were just on the grounds outside the fence. Now, that's still considered, and it's interesting to me because we talk about Kirtland Air Force Base, but a lot of that area, especially even on the east side of the mountains, where a lot of testing was done in what's called Coyote Canyon, that I think Bruce Maccabee wrote about, that was Department of Energy land. So Kirtland Air Force Base had their own little area, I suppose. Then you had the Manzano Mountains, which was patrolled by the guards with the nuclear materials in them. But the Manzano Mountains on the the west side of the Manzano Mountains towards the Kirtland Air Force Base, towards the Albuquerque side, that's where the objects were coming down. That's clearly visible from Paul's roof. If you look at the sketches, and I mean, it's like due south 2 miles from the third floor. He had a perfect view of that.
The reason I'm asking this question is because why would two guys with the U.S. government, Moore and Doty, spend their time trying to make this guy nuts? For there's what's the intent? Where's the intent to make this guy nuts? Why him? And my idea is, or I'm thinking, I'm putting on my investigator's hat. Well, he filmed something that he shouldn't have filmed.
Oh yeah, I have no doubt about it. And in fact,
and they said we got to stop this right now, right at this minute.
Now, for whatever it's worth, Chris, according to Moore, this was an NSA project.
Well, I had to be. I mean, to go after this guy the way they did, to put up a hoax with Myrna Hansen because they believe that, to bug people's houses the way they did, to drive this man into a mental institution. He was hospitalized. I mean, there was a point where he had a standoff with the police because he was putting sandbags around his house. He was getting ready to war with the aliens. And so to go to all this extreme, there is something they were trying to protect.
Yeah,
do you agree with that, sir?
No, I agree. Oh, yeah, I agree 100%. My understanding is that it was somewhere around Myrna Hansen or a little bit after that, Paul began to get a little disillusioned with the response he'd been getting from the Air Force. And he began to kind of go off the reservation, writing his senators and whomever else. And it seems to me that was at the point at which somebody decided we need to nip this guy in the bud. And I believe part of the intent was to simply stuff him with so much talk, give him so much information he would believe that they're aliens. Give him a computer, have the aliens communicate with him, have the aliens talking about, zapping people, whatever else. You mentioned the Manzano Mountain area. There is a picture, well-known picture, that shows something. I don't know what it is, but Paul also had showed that to me. And in the foreground, you'll see a guy standing by, looks like a Jeep. My understanding is that was when Paul was with Ernest Edwards and they had driven around the south end of the mountains, Manzanos, and gone up towards Coyote Canyon. Coyote Canyon was the story that was written up later in the papers that came out through AFOSI, that a security guard had approached one of what they call the last bunker on the left. And if you look at Coyote Canyon, it stretches back that way. And there was a facility back there. And one night, a security guard had approached that and saw a disc-shaped object, either above it or right by it. And as he got close, the thing took off. That was written up in the documents that were released by AFOSI that I think were a red herring. I don't know that I think that ever occurred. I think that was just something to implicate UFOs were being seen around there. They made a vague reference to Paul Bennewitz as having seen, someone involved in things in the area. They never said Paul had contacted us in June. But there was a document that was put out by Ernest Edwards. He had come back to the base when a couple of guys had come to visit from Sandia Security at the behest of Senator, I don't remember the name off the top of my head right now. These two guys had come to Ernest Edwards to talk to him about Paul Bennewitz. And he outlined a number of things, but he stated at the beginning of that conversation, first contact with Paul Bennewitz, January of 1980, not 6-8 months later, like you would be led to believe if you looked at the AFOSI documents that had come out. And then in November, they bring him on base to have this big, dog and pony show, I suppose, in which then they ushered Paul out the door thinking he was crazy. And I happen to believe that probably by that time, he was already so full of conviction that aliens are running around. They've abducted Myrna Hansen. They've got an underground base up at Dulce. And honestly, when I first talked to Paul, I called him on the phone and he was talking I think it was 1982 or 3 at the time, but he was already talking about all this kind of alien stuff. And honestly, I was like, It wasn't until he said that he had called him about the films. And I said, wait, Paul, what films are you talking about? Oh, the films I got from my roof. Whoa. And all the time where Peter Gersten, Linda Howe, Bill, all these people had already been making subtle comments coming out at the time, I had never heard any mention that he had actually gotten films off of his roof. When I saw those films, and then I finally looked at the time frame of him contacting the Air Force within a matter of weeks, because he said he still had film from Dulce on it and he had to go get it developed. Then things began to fall into place that he contacted him. They put him in touch with Doty. Doty probably went and saw what Paul had and they talked to Edwards. And by that time, Edwards had already gotten to know Paul as well and been to visit his house. They probably knew we need to head this off. We need to do something to make this whole thing look discreditable before it ever gets out of hand. And unfortunately, Paul it's one of the things about the AARO files that I guess are finally in Albuquerque that I'd like to take a look at to see what Paul had been writing to AARO during this time. That I'm sure they didn't know what to do with him either. But it could simply be like we have these days, people who really have been looking hard to find something. And when finally they think they've got it, then all these other ideas begin to come into play. And it's easy for somebody to kind of go off the road you know, when they're fed, especially like was being done with AFOSI, when they're fed all this information to make them believe that they're on the right track, you know, and like they say, people like that, it's going to be
What do you
hard.
think? Yeah. What do you think the main purpose? Do you think that he was filming experimental craft or something like that? Where why would they try to make him go crazy and distract him?
I think at this time, it was probably because once you have a guy talking about, well, let me back up for just a second. If you look at Paul Bennewitz, the films that he got, at least the photos he sent to me, there are no distinguishing characteristics of mountainside or buildings or anything. I think if he had just gone and said, hey, I got these films, they could have written them off. But he wasn't the only one who saw the objects. His wife saw them. And he didn't get more. Apparently, he had still shots with a telephoto lens and all sorts of things. I'd love to have seen what those looked like. But apparently, he was also a credible enough guy at the time. He owned Thunder Scientific, had government contracts. He was doing well enough. You know, the Four Hills area is a ritzy part of Albuquerque for sure. That I think he would have been taken seriously enough if he had gotten traction. And I think at that point, the easiest thing to do would be to just defuse the guy any way, shape, or form you could. Fill him with information, put out documents that the public can run with, plant MJ12 or Aquarius or whatever else. And I'll be one of those guys that I'll tell you, filing FOI requests for Aquarius, you can wait a year, 2 years, 3 years. You know, that's a stall that if you get off on that track. But I think that was one of the reasons too, like him as much as I did, if he was predisposed to believe that he was right. You know, I sometimes go back, if you ever watched, what was the 1920s movie that had Robert Redford and, you know, these guys in it at the time, where the mafia guy, and what was the
You said 1920s.
Yeah, it was an old movie that was about the 1920s.
Oh, of the 1920s. I got it.
But the point at the end was, I think Robert Shaw played the head gangster guy.
Oh, the Sting?
The Sting. The whole thing was a setup. And Robert Shaw was so sure he could not be fooled that they knew he'd buy it. They just set it up enough to be sure that he had no doubt that there was no way he could get played. So when he thought they had killed each other and the cops were showing up, he left and they were all off the hook. And I feel like there are people that are that way. They are so certain that they could not be played. And I hate to say this, but I have a feeling there are a lot of PhDs out there that are so sure they're educated, they've got a PhD, they could not be played. But I bet you put a good card shark in front of them and it'll look like magic to them. But I have a feeling that's maybe in Paul's case, he was so certain that he could analyze it and figure it out, and his equipment that he built would not lie to him. But you're up against people who got the time and the money and the knowledge and the more money than he had, who know how to play this. And if there was anything with AFOSI or intelligence agencies involved, psychologically, I have a feeling you could probably feed any of us enough stuff that we might not be sure.
Let me ask you a question, Mr. Lambright. Did Bennewitz have any children?
Yes.
They did?
Yes.
Have you ever been in contact with those children?
Two, maybe 3 sons.
You've been in contact with the children, sir?
I met one of them, and it was only because a few years ago I drove to Santa Fe and was actually going to give at a conference in Santa Fe.
I'm just curious as to why the children that now that Doty and Moore, I mean, all this information comes out that they actually had a campaign against them to probably drive them nuts. Why they haven't done a civil suit? There's been other civil
suits. If they even pay attention,
My understanding is one of his sons was with him on one of his trips up to Dulce. And he wrote in the papers at one point, he laughed because his son was muttering about trying to get the camera set so they could take a picture of something that they had seen. I met one of the sons because I just felt I should do it. I did try to contact Paul numerous times after he disconnected with everyone. And I wrote letters to him, and then I wrote the one to his wife. But I stopped by Thunder Scientific just because, I don't know what better way to say it than to pay my respects. I went in and talked to his son, and I did the best I could. And it was only 5 minutes or less, just standing there quietly trying to tell him that I had been in contact with his father, and I had a lot of respect for him, and I hated what had happened to him, and that sort of thing. And he was very polite. There was no contention or anything about it.
I just think
But
that
you're
the
correct.
government, for what they did, owes one, some kind of acknowledgement what they did to him, and two, maybe a compensation to the family for what they did to this poor man.
Maybe. And I'll just give you my speculation on maybe some of that. If at some point things had gone south, even Doty has talked about, he went to talk to Paul when he was in the hospital, and tried to tell him what he was doing, which I don't know whether I believe that anyway. But if at some point somebody went to his family and said, okay, look, this is what happened, but this was so classified that we could not do any other way. However, we're going to try to make some amends. We're going to assure, and this is total speculation, but I've thought about it. We're going to assure that Paul and his family will be taken care of. You each that are running now, the sons are running Thunder Scientific. We will make sure you have contracts out the wazoo. Would that have been enough under the circumstances? I mean, if you sue them and they back off with all the stuff they've got and paint a bit worse picture of your dad being a crazy, nobody wins anything. But would that or could that potentially be enough that for generations to come, his sons, their children, the mother, would that have been enough for the sons to just, and I don't know, maybe they did find some kind of work out an arrangement that but you're right. I don't know. I would hope my sons would sue the hell out of them. These days, why isn't something like this brought up to our congressman, Tim Burchett?
Well,
Say, if you don't want to get it from the Air Force, you can at least bring in Doty. You can bring in everybody else.
Sir, you had David Grush say people have been murdered over this thing, and everybody looked like a deer in headlights. Like, okay, whatever.
And even Don, last week I heard you talking about Lee Graham being threatened with losing his job over that sort of thing.
Yeah.
And my feeling is, if they would go after Lee Graham, why is nobody going after Grush or Hal?
They are. They have. They have.
According to him, but he's still out there talking. And I don't know. biggest concern
they
is not
released
Lee
Christian. They released his private medical records.
I recall hearing about that. Yeah, that's a shame to do as well.
Bringing up the fact that he was suffering from PTSD. I mean, Jesus, the guy was a veteran in Afghanistan. All right. PTSD.
I've read about Grush. I have no doubt about him. It's the same way, if I can mention, if we can, not to get off the subject of Bennewitz as well, but the whole thing with Fravor and these pilots. I'm convinced of what Fravor has said and what Dietrich and the others have said as far as what they saw. Not that I know what they saw. However, I have a problem with the idea that they did not get an actual film of what Fravor saw, his encounter, because it's written in documentation that's attributed to Alex Dietrich. It was published first on the To the Stars website, although the names were blotted out. Then it came out again later. It's been out publicly now. I've got a copy of it myself. That's an interview that was done with Dietrich at a hotel somewhere in Washington. And it names several people, to government, to industry, something like this, people that were there. And in that, her testimony right there, she stipulates that Fravor had the videotape from his gun camera. That Fravor, this is when she says, when nobody came to investigate, Fravor got aggravated and slammed and locked the door on their little room there and made a copy of the tape from his gun camera. Not the helmet cam. Many times I've heard people ask Fravor, did you get any video? And he says, no, we didn't turn on the helmet cam because you go kind of dizzy from the way your head's shaking around. But that's not what Dietrich. Now, I actually have tried to reach out to Alex Dietrich. The only way I could, I think, was through her LinkedIn address. No response whatsoever. I wanted to find out.
I've got all of her information. Yeah.
Well, but there's the point. I would like to just know this document that was published first on the To the Stars website and has now come out with all the names, phone numbers, the whole 9 yards. Who was in that meeting when they were interviewing Dietrich? And if she made it clear that Fravor had the tape from his gun camera, she's not talking about the guys that went out 3 hours later, you know, the Tic Tac video. Go ahead, Martin. What do you got?
Oh, no, we have 3 minutes. Just letting you know we have 3 minutes.
Anyway,
So we're pretty much,
those are the kind of questions
you know,
I
we
ask.
kind of, made a little bit of a jag from Paul Bennewitz. But if we can just jump back real quickly in this one question is, do we actually know what actually happened to him? Did he pass away in an institution? Do we know, or anything like that?
I believe he was in hospice care. I mean, I'd heard somebody say that they thought he killed himself. Not to my knowledge. My understanding, because I've heard some things said about him showing some respect for the nurse that was looking after him in hospice, something to that effect. But my thinking at this point is I believe he finally passed away. Maybe all the cigarettes had something to do with it as well. I don't know that for certain. You know, I don't want to pry into that kind of thing. But I would say if his sons or family are ever watching any of this, there are a lot of questions that I would like to ask them directly, especially what became of the films that he actually took. Did they have it? Is there a shoebox in the attic somewhere? I wouldn't be surprised though if, like Dodie said, they went in there with black bag treatment if a lot of that stuff vanished. You know, but I know he had some that he sent me the pictures of, and they were in that reel to reel. But I think those would be something really worth seeing if they were out there.
Well, I wish we had another hour because I would like to take the opportunity in the last minute or so to say John Lear had a hell of a lot to do with this story. And Lear, as a matter of fact, that's when I met Lear in 88, 89. And it was because of Paul Bennewitz, but that's a story for another time.
My story with Lear, which you can probably have heard before, is when he admitted to me, bull-faced, standing in his house, that he had helped fabricate that O.H. Krill memo that was going around and people were swearing by.
Yeah.
And I was stunned. You can cut us off when we're ready, Mark. I stepped back and I told him flat out, John, how can I even associate with you now? And I have told that whenever I could. You know.
I asked him point blank about that, and he absolutely admitted it when I had him on my show. Thank you all, gentlemen. Thank you so much. I thought it was a very good night this evening.
Meet you, Don. Nice
and we'll be back. We'll be back next week, same time, same place.
Thanks again, Martin. Have a great night, guys. Bye-bye.